This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for November 27th, 2018, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, checkers.
We have a great show for you today. Friend of the show, Stuart Robbins of astronomy fame, is going to give us a little earful with a voicemail he left us regarding flat earthers and impact craters. Adam is going to explore what happens to citizenship when the child is born in the air or at sea.
That's right.
But first, I'm going to talk to you about effective donating 2018. On the day we're recording this, it is Giving Tuesday, which is, quote, a global movement for giving and volunteering taking place each year after Black Friday. The opening day of the giving season is a time when charities, companies, and individuals join together and rally for favorite causes. In the same way that retailers take part in Black Friday, the giving community comes together for Giving Tuesday. Mm-hmm. Now, regular listeners will know and recall that I often do a segment on effective giving around this time because, well, honestly, each day is literally life or death for some of us, and you can do something about it. But I didn't just want to rehash exactly what I said last year, but I still think some of those tips are important. So this year, I'll try to do a higher level overview, but then leave a bit more room for general discussion at the end. Today, I want to take a quick look at issues about overhead, CEO pay, restricting donations, splitting donations, receipts for small donations, and focusing on effectiveness. With overhead, many people are very concerned about overhead. Yeah. When discussing charities, it's one of the first things they mention. Oh, it's too high. Overhead's too high. Well, what does that mean? Is 20% too high? Is 40%? Understandably, donors grab onto this metric because it seems like a way of comparing different organizations. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that by shifting or coding budget allocations differently, you may get different results. Consequently, the difference between 8% and 12% in two different charities may not be meaningful at all just because the charities have coded the information differently. The point is, overhead is just a number. Many charities don't even have anyone audit it, so does that even really matter? If it's 30%, you might not want to donate, but investigate. And it's also possible some charity needs 50% of overhead for its work, but as a general heuristic, that is too high. And as an FYI, the Against Malaria Foundation approaches zero.
Does it make sense, perhaps, to compare overhead on charities that are doing very similar work?
You could, but I think it's still not the right metric. Yeah. It's going to be about effectiveness, and we'll get to that later.
Fair.
CEO pay and salaries at charities is also what people seem to complain about or are very much concerned about.
Yeah.
They care a lot about what CEOs are paid, and most think they're paid too much. Maybe, but what if they aren't? Mm-hmm. How do you know? Perhaps you need to hire qualified people to do complicated work, like running large charities, which are like organizations.
Yeah.
I want to challenge the belief that people who work at charities shouldn't get paid a lot. What matters is whether the CEO and other people are effective at having an impact. I think this is because giving to charity doesn't feel like you're purchasing something, but you're committing a moral act, and moral acts should be free of financial incentives. I think that's what it is. I understand this, but I don't think it's actually coherent. Yeah. And on some level, you are using your money to try to purchase the reduction of suffering or some other good, whether it be education or some sort of toy for some child.
Yeah, if some superstar-style CEO is needed to more effectively run that charity, and that money is worth it. It's hard to think of it that way. But
right. You know the old saying, it takes money to reduce suffering. What about restricting donations? So you want to donate to the Red Cross, but you want to help a specific emergency that they're involved in helping. Mm-hmm. To do this, you click on donate, and then you click on the box that indicates your preference. But is this really necessary? Yes, you have a better knowledge of where your money might be going, but then this limits the organization, and perhaps they would like the flexibility to allocate those resources even better. You're already trusting them in the first place to do this, so I think it's okay to trust them to allocate the resources best.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Now, what about splitting donations? It always makes sense to have a diversified portfolio, right? Whether investment or charitable giving? Well, not quite. Every donation requires a transaction. Paperwork has to be shuffled and banking has to occur. And the more of these you have, the more transaction costs there'll be. At the extreme, you could imagine donating $1 to 100 charities is highly ineffective compared to donating $100 to one charity.
Yes.
The paperwork would be frustrating and annoying. Now, if you want to so-called diversify your portfolio, I do recommend you select a few charities. Maybe it's between 2 and 4, and then next year pick a different 2 and 4, or 6 months later pick a different 2 and 4, if that's your inclination.
What about the idea of, say, making a monthly donation to a charity versus more lump sum? Is there a big difference there?
Well, I think that depends on, your budget, how you want to allocate your resources. Can you trust yourself to make the lump sum, say it's at the end of the year?
Yeah.
Can you trust yourself to then continue the monthly donation? But for charities, if you're going to be consistent with the monthly donation, they actually quite appreciate that because then they have a sense of how they can plan their spending.
Sure, they have predictable income.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, if you do an annual lump sum to the same charity for 5-10 years in a row, then that also has some predictability.
Wow.
There's also an issue about not getting receipts for small donations. This is a personal pet peeve, and I think it's a huge mistake that continues under the guise of nobility or something like that. People think, well, I just gave $10 at a fundraiser, so I don't really need a receipt because the amount is so low. I don't want to seem petty by asking for it. I'm just trying to do something good. I don't need the tax break. Well, if you make enough money and live in a place where there are tax deductions for charity, you can get like 30% in many places in Canada. Yeah. So if you donate $20 and you have a receipt, you can actually get $6 back from your income. So $20 costs you $14. Alternatively, $10 costs you $10. So you might consider donating another $4 so the organization actually gets $10 more.
Yeah.
Last time, someone wrote in and said that this was depriving the government of money and that it implied I didn't support government activities. I will restate what I wrote then is that I think the marginal impact of that money is much higher if you give it to an effective charity compared to what the government might spend it on. Because as much as the government does wonderful things like healthcare and other such services, they also sell tanks to Saudi Arabia. What about giving to things that advertise well instead of what's most effective? This is just the general idea of effectiveness. Why do you donate to the causes you donate to? This has been a recurring question I've asked our listeners to consider. Was there an ad you saw on TV? Was it just because several of your friends are doing it? You just heard about it somewhere, something gripped you somehow. But what if you choose something that is most effective? How do you know? Does the organization you want to donate to support randomized controlled trials? The interventions behind them? Are they transparent? Do they tell you these things are going on? Do you have any idea of any of this, actually? Yeah. It's not enough to say a certain group of people, say, received X amount of money. What did it actually do? How do you know it had an impact, and what's the control group? The primary thing through all of this stuff that I've been talking about is cost effectiveness, both of the charity and yourself. How much good can the charity do for every dollar you donate, or time? And how can I be the most effective with each dollar I donate? Charities respond to donors, so the more donors push them to provide detailed methods and descriptions of how their interventions actually work, the more they'll actually do it. And I think you actually have some responsibility here. It's not enough for you to be just a sort of vague general benefactor in the background saying, well, I've given some money, I'm just helping people. Your money is causing effects to happen in the world, and you are accountable for those effects, even if they're supposed to be good. What can you do if you truly don't know where to start? Well, as I usually say, please go to givewell.org. Mm-hmm. They are a charity that evaluates other charities. Highly rigorous. They've been doing this for many years. You could spend many hours on their website. They're very transparent about everything they do, the methods, the value assumptions that go into their quantitative analysis. But for the moment, though, I just want to highlight that they just released their top charities of the year, and Against Malaria Foundation is once again on that list, as well as some others. A point that I think is worth emphasizing, it isn't that malaria is the biggest problem in and of itself. It is that it's one of the most effective problems to address given the scale, the current attention it receives, and whether this organization can use more money effectively. And it can. To reiterate, when I ask you to consider whether your charity is most effective, I want you to seriously ask yourself the question and see where it leads you. Don't get so focused on the intervention that you lose sight of the outcome. Perhaps you want to improve people getting vaccines in less developed countries. There are many ways to do this. What I want to highlight is that the vaccine is not the outcome. It is a proxy. The outcome is that fewer people get sick. Yeah. The outcome is that there's less suffering. I challenge all those listening to come up with a better overall goal than to reduce suffering of things that can suffer.
So, Darren, each time that you do this segment, and you do it once a year, and it's always very valuable, and this is a great time of year to be doing it, you refer to GiveWell, but they're not the only charity evaluator. And so I probably asked this question in the past, but what makes them better than, say, the Life You Can Save? Do they both highlight the same charities, or do they highlight different charities, and what's the difference between them?
That's a great question, Pat. And there is some overlap between the Life You Can Save, which is the organization coming out of Peter Singer, and Peter Singer's work has inspired a lot of the effective altruism community, which is linked to GiveWell in the broad sense. GiveWell is a bit more rigorous with their methodology than Life You Can Save, even though I think the pattern matching of appropriate good charities would be very similar for both. And I want to contrast, say, both of those, which I think are pretty good, with something like Charity Navigator, which was mainly looking at things like overhead. Recently, they've started to shift a bit towards impact, but I don't think that's sufficient. So I think GiveWell is a good place to start. There's also an animal charity evaluation website for those who are concerned about animal welfare.
That's a good point you mentioned that, Darren, because you say I challenge anyone to say that it's the reduction of suffering and people that can suffer, but there are certainly some people that would prioritize animal welfare sort of at a different ratio compared to humans.
Right.
Where some people would say, well, human is worth 100 cows, and someone would say, oh, a cow is worth half a human, or something like that. So, a person needs, there is still a certain level of subjectivity there, because there are some answers that do not have a concrete, this is what matters.
Correct. And just to clarify, I actually said reducing the suffering of things that can suffer.
That's you said it better
intentionally thinking about animals. And what I would want to say is, if you are someone who values a certain ratio of human to animal, which I'm not saying is inaccurate, it makes some sense, just try to be consistent. If that's the case, then just follow it through. So just some overall thoughts to close. Many of us are troubled by the state of the world. This is partly due to the news and negativity bias, and not absorbing enough Steven Pinker. But it is true that things are so much better than they used to be, and still that things are awful for so many. Last week, I attended an event by Oxfam where I learned some women in refugee camps tried to limit their intake of water because they don't want to get attacked going to the bathroom.
Wow.
And there's hunger, and sex trafficking, and slavery, and disease, and on and on. Okay, so then what? Don't just be sad or frustrated. That doesn't do anything to help the world. Meaningful action can. If you're listening to this, you are probably in a relatively unique position in the history of the world regarding how you can help people. A little time on the internet and some clicks later, and you can help people you've never met and never will, and you'll make the world a better place. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to buy 7,000 anti-malarial bed nets that will help protect over 13,000 people. That's wild. That's entire villages. Yeah. This stuff actually matters. Now, if you think saving lives is actually bad due to overpopulation, then find a charity that does good work with providing birth control and family planning. Yep. If you don't have a lot of money, you can donate your time or spread effective donating tips. Try to get people to read Doing Good Better by William McCaskill. There's always a move to make instead of just being saddened by the state of the world. The intelligent move is not to just complain, it's to do something.
That's a pretty uplifting message, Darren, because I think lots of us feel like the problem is so overwhelming that there's nothing that can be done.
Right. It's actually called the argument from futility. Because I can't do everything, I won't do anything. Which, when you state it that way, they're like, that's terrible logic. That makes no sense at all.
Yeah, I see a lot of despair in the world based on a view that things are getting worse. But, things are getting better, but they can be better. So do something positive.
Yeah, actually, Our World in Data had a great line. These 3 phrases, which I think can help anchor various conversations. Things are amazing, things are awful, and things can get better.
Yeah.
Something like that. And can we all agree things are great and things are terrible and they can get better?
Yes.
Otherwise, you have people who which each agree with each part in isolation, but they end up debating because they didn't clarify their terms.
Yeah.
Beep. Hey guys, thanks for taking my call. This is a call-in show, right? Right. So I wanted to talk about 2 things. First is a slight follow-up from the Flat Earth episode that I did with you, Pat, and Christina. So I was listening to another podcast, and they made a really good point about acceleration. So one of these claims that Flat Earth proponents like to make is that we're going around the planet because we're on top of it and it's spinning around the sun and the solar system is going around the galaxy, and that we should feel that. Because if we're in a car or we're in a plane or we're on a train or on a bicycle or something that's moving, we can feel that motion. The thing is, we don't feel a constant velocity. We feel acceleration. Acceleration is when velocity changes. In fact, it's the derivative of velocity. So we will feel something when that motion changes. But if we're in a constant motion, we don't feel it. One of the good analogies, actually, that you can experience almost anywhere is stand on an escalator or a moving sidewalk. Those are about as constant and bump-free, in other words, acceleration-free, as you can get. As soon as you get on that escalator or get on that moving sidewalk, you probably won't feel it moving. If you closed your eyes, unless it is a bumpy moving sidewalk, you're not going to notice it. Same thing about Earth. You don't notice the motion because it's constant. If it were to change, in which case something else is going on and really, really scary, and you probably don't have to worry so much about the shape of the Earth, but something bad going on. Unless that actually happens, so unless our velocity changes, you're really not going to notice it. So that's sort of the debunking of that particular flat Earth claim. The other follow-up is, well, I guess I can talk about this because I was specifically called out on the episode, and then Darren suggested that I might even do a call-in about this on the episode after that. This isn't a late night drunken call, is it? Anyway, so the thing is this whole late heavy bombardment thing that Darren was talking about with the age of the solar system or the history of the solar system. So the thing is that the late heavy bombardment is a hypothesized period that happened later in the solar system's history, around 3.9 to 4.1 billion years ago, as opposed to during the solar system's formation about 4.5 billion years ago. So the thing is that we thought a long time ago that this actually happened, and this was based on samples returned from the moon. The thing is that when lunar chronologists were dating the samples, when they got them back from Apollo and from the Russian lunar probes, the way that they date them is they take a bunch of little pieces of the rock and get a radiometric age, and then they have a range of ages. What they do is they basically put those ages into a histogram, and they look at, is there any particular age that stands out as the most common one? We call that a plateau when you do a cumulative histogram. If there were a lot of plateaus that were all about the same age from a lot of different rock samples, then we think that those rocks formed at about that time. And the thing is that a lot of different samples from the moon had the same plateau ages. And so they thought, hey, this must mean that there was an intense period of bombardment that was resetting all of those ages to about the same time, about 3.9 to 4.1 billion years ago. Thing is, now that we think that a lot of those samples, even though they're from different places on the near side of the moon, all came from one impact basin, Imbrium. We don't think that they came from a bunch of different ones. So therefore, the evidence for the late heavy bombardment from the radiometric dating kinda is in a lot more question these days than it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. I guess not 60 years ago. This would be Apollo, so about 50 years ago as of 2018, the time I'm leaving this lovely not drunk voice message. So the evidence from the radiometric dates is kind of in question today. But the thing is that when people were doing this in the 1970s, when they were getting these ages, they turned to people in other fields and said, hey, we're seeing this spike. You should factor that into your models. So the people who were doing crater counts said, oh, okay, well, so we have this spike around 3.9 to 4.1 billion years ago. And it got incorporated into all these different kinds of models, and it became the late heavy bombardment. Problem with that is that there actually isn't really any good crater evidence, because to get crater ages, you have to have radiometric dates. And so if the radiometric date evidence goes away, then the evidence from craters goes away, because it's a whole circular argument. That's a separate issue. That's my day job right now. We don't need to talk about that. Thing is, the evidence that we thought was there for the late heavy bombardment isn't actually there. It could have happened, but the evidence for it we no longer consider to be good evidence. So with that said, have a good night. See y'all later, checkers.
I can honestly say that knowing Stuart has made me a smarter person.
Oh, me too, for sure.
We appreciate his rigor, and thankfully I have no emotional attachment to the data associated with late heavy bombardment. So I'm happily going, oh well, I guess not. At least not at the moment. Not yet.
This is one of the best late night drunken calls I've gotten from Stuart.
Hey, Reality Check, you guys up? Let me tell you why you're wrong.
That said, we're very lucky to have him be involved with the show.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Very much so. Exactly. Thank you, Stu. And now we turn to Adam. Well, we've all kind of heard of maybe people conceiving while on a plane or on a boat. But what happens to the citizenship if those children are actually born at sea or in the air?
It's a great question, Darren. Now, as some of you may remember, on a recent show, I discussed the topic of U.S. citizenship as it pertained to birthright citizenship. And longtime listener Evil Eye asked a seemingly simple enough question. What about those who are born on a ship or plane? Great question. Not that simple to answer, but I'll try to give it a shot. Citizenship is always a bit complicated because there are so many factors at play. In a Quora article on the topic, one contributor, Katie Kincaid, says that asking what nation one might be a citizen of in some odd circumstance is the wrong way to look at it. One would rather need to look at every nation in the world, currently 206, and examine the circumstances of the birth in relation to each and every one. That's not easy. So what does this really mean? The location of the birth is only one small part, with the person's parentage playing a role as well. And in that case, it's not simply about the parent's citizenship, but also how long their parents may have lived in some countries which they are or aren't citizens of. So you cannot be a citizen of a country but still have a child that gets that citizenship because of how long you live there, or you can be a citizen but then your child doesn't get it because you didn't live there long enough. Depends on the country, bunch of factors. Further to this, some countries will grant citizenship based on grandparent citizenship, or citizenship may be inherited through countries which no longer exist. So we can more specifically ask, if a person was born in X circumstances, are they a citizen of Y, and potentially get an answer to that question. Even then, it's not always super clear. So much to say, what about a plane or a boat? Births on planes aren't excessively common since international flights are, all considered, not terribly long. This brings me to a bit of a side myth, which is that women, after a certain number of weeks of pregnancy, aren't allowed to fly. This is often repeated as relating to a trimester, a specific trimester. My wife is currently any day now weeks pregnant, and looked this up briefly while traveling for work not long ago. There's no strict law against flying while pregnant, though at some point it's less than advisable unless you want to put citizenship laws to the test, and this is around 32 weeks. Some airlines will have a policy against flying after a number of weeks pregnancy, usually requiring a doctor's note past a certain number of weeks, while some airlines just have no restrictions at all. Sometimes they'll just sort of have advisories. In some cases, pregnant women are asked not to sit in the emergency exit row, though this is more dependent on their physical ability to be responsive in an emergency, and this can apply to all sorts of people. All this said, the reason for which we have laws about planes is that they're pretty much the same as boats, and, at least historically, people were on boats for long enough that babies were often born on them. So, forget all the specifics about your parents and such. The question we want the answer to is really, for the purposes of citizenship, what country is a plane or boat considered to be when a person is born on it? Well, this has changed somewhat over the years. According to Wikipedia, before 1961, a year which I will get back to, many states had laws stating that births and deaths aboard an aircraft registered to a state are considered to have occurred in that state's territory. And when I say state, I mean state as in country, as in nation, not as in the United States of America. I say many states, which means this isn't universal, as there was not a single worldwide law about this. Before 1961, there still isn't today. Then in 1944 came the Convention on International Civil Aviation. This is a convention regulating international air travel. Practically speaking, this wasn't established to account for babies born in flight, but to set common rules for international air travel. This convention has 192 parties, which is most nations, but not all of them. According to this convention, all aircraft have the nationality of the state in which they are registered and follow those laws. But the convention does not make any mention of birth on a country's aircraft, so it still remained up to the country to determine if birth on that aircraft is said to be in the country. Finally, in 1961 comes the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, which, as you might guess from the name, sought to reduce instances of statelessness. This convention states that someone born on a ship or aircraft in international waters be considered to be born in the state of the craft's registration. But this only applies to births where the child would otherwise be stateless. So if they would inherit citizenship through a parent, for example, it wouldn't apply. Further, this is not a particularly well-observed convention, with some 73 parties, less than half of all states, observing it. So we're sort of back to, it kind of depends. We're a Canadian podcast, so let's look into what happens here, or rather, not quite here, on an aircraft registered for here, but not in the country. Well, there isn't a set rule for this, and it's assessed on a case-by-case basis. Parentage is the most important factor, but a vehicle being Canadian registered would likely be a factor if there was a case that had to be considered, but there's no specific law. In the U.S., if a person is born on a foreign, that being a non-U.S. ship docked at a U.S. port or within U.S. waters, they are a U.S. citizen. The same goes for U.S. airspace. So if you're born within the U.S. limits, it's good, even if you're not on a U.S. ship or plane. There are a few exceptions, such as foreign diplomats or invading foreign enemy forces. So keep that in mind if you're thinking of invading the U.S. while 30-something weeks pregnant.
I believe if you're literally birthed on an anchor, you are then that anchor baby that often are very concerned about.
Now, being born on a U.S. ship outside of U.S. territory does not count as a birth on U.S. soil, and birthright citizenship would not apply in this case. A child born in the international waters on a boat is listed as being born at sea, and if born in an aircraft is listed as being born in the air.
This is for real.
That's for real. And some might say, I belong in the air.
I'd imagine that child, as they get older, get questioned a lot about their birthplace.
Probably.
And their parents' poor travel planning, quite frankly.
What's a person's citizenship if they're born on a plane or a boat? It depends on a lot of factors. For some, but not all countries, you would be considered to be born in the country which that vessel is registered to, but this is not consistently applied, not even in the US or Canada. All said, that doesn't actually matter in many cases, as only a relatively small number of countries even have birthright citizenship laws. It doesn't matter if being born on a plane registered to a state is considered to be that state's property if that doesn't even grant you citizenship in that country.
True. Because I'm thinking of some weird hack where someone just finds a barge that's from a country that they want to have their child to have citizenship in and then tries to give birth on it. But that's so unlikely and elaborate and not even likely to work.
It's not much easier than just going to the country. And you can probably do that for Italy, for example, because I've seen some instances of someone born on an Italian flight. But yeah, like if you're in Europe, just cross the border.
So yeah, if you're comparing strategies, going to the country itself probably seems easier.
Yes, for sure.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks for joining us once again, listeners. I gave you some tips on effective donating and to encourage you to think about how and why you donate. Stuart, once again, provided his insight and rigor, which always improves our podcast output. And Adam talked to us about babies born in the sea or the air, and it depends.
Yeah.
Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone. Hi, Checkers. Producer Pat here. As usual, I get the last word. I just said we'll talk to you next week, but in fact, we won't. This will be our last regular show of the year for a few reasons, not the least of which is, as Adam just mentioned, he and his wife are expecting a baby. We do have a couple things that we're going to put into the feed, including a really interesting, what I think is going to be a 2-part interview, so keep an ear out for that. But on behalf of myself and the rest of the crew, we wanted to wish you a very happy and safe holidays, and we look forward to talking to you in the new year.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
I think now we turn to a cranky old man who called us about something related to astronomy.
He's younger than all of us.
Oh, no! Oh, that hurts.
My wife is currently any day now weeks pregnant and looked this up briefly while traveling for work not long ago.
Wait a minute, Adam. Didn't you have a vasectomy?
No.